Whew, it is Wednesday, October 14th, and that sun is beating down today. I don't know what's going on. I'm heading out for a short walk to get a cup of coffee, and lately I've been thinking about addresses. When you spend a lot of time overseas, you just naturally think a lot about addresses, especially if you change countries and change cities frequently. You have to get used to a whole new system of addresses. And of course, that ties in with maps. And I think a lot about maps as well. Given how much I've been thinking about addresses lately, I was quite happy to discover that one of my favorite podcasts did an entire episode about a new book all about the history of addresses. This podcast is called 99% Invisible, and it focuses generally on design, and so it has a starting point of design, but then it uses that as a jumping off point to talk about history and culture and science and a lot of different topics that interest me. The guy who started it and the host, his name is Roman Mars, and he has a great voice for podcasting, and I love the way he thinks, and I love his ideas. This episode of the podcast is called The Address Book, and that's also the name of the book that the podcast is about. And in the podcast, Roman Mars interviews the author. Her name is Deirdre Mask. Boy, these small streets are so surprisingly busy all the time, even for being a small street. A good jumping off point for thinking about addresses is probably trying to imagine a time before addresses exist. Today we just take them for granted, everybody, almost everybody. Oddly enough, one thing they do say in the book is that about 1 billion people in the world right now currently don't have an address. So that's kind of an interesting fact. But most people I know, and I'm sure most people you know, do have an address. And we grew up in a house or an apartment on a street. And that street has a name. And our house or apartment has a number. And we just sort of take that for granted. We grew up with addresses, and addresses are normal, and we never really think about them. But they're really quite strange and quite unusual if you think about them from a historical point of view. I mean, if you go back far enough in time, you're talking about villages and farming communities, and people own land, and they put a house on that land, and that's their house, and that's the end of it. The street doesn't have a name, their house doesn't have a number, it's just addresses didn't exist. And that was normal for much of history. And then back in those days, people navigated in a way that's kind of funny, because it's similar to the way I navigate today to an extent. I talked the other day about going to immigration by taxi, and I struggled a little bit communicating with the taxi driver about where I wanted to go. And he was sort of using landmarks to navigate instead of maps. And a long time ago, of course, that was normal. If you wanted a friend to come over to your house before addresses existed, you had to describe where your house was. It's like, well, my house is over by the vegetable produce market. You'll see a temple, and then there's a big tree, and you describe what is around your house, and you would probably use what you can see, the temple and things like that. You might even describe how things smell. It's like if you live near a market or something. Deirdre Mask talks about this in her book, and she says, yeah, people might say, my house is over here, and you'll start to smell flowers because there's a flower market nearby, something like that. You use all your senses to describe where you live. And that's just how things were for a long time. kind of an appropriate topic for my walkabouts here, because I do this sort of thing all the time. I just go out walking around and then I have to figure out where I am and get oriented. And just now I made a connection, which is kind of funny. I've never gone down this street before. It's a brand new place for me. Yeah, it's quite interesting right here. And I looked off to my left and I saw these little houses over there. And I thought, well, those are interesting looking places. Look at all those trees. It has a very village feel to it. And then I spotted these cement drainage pipes. And then the light bulb went off that many times I've walked along the road on the other side of this area, because this is the cement drainage pipe factory, where they make them over here. And I've kind of looked at this area from the other side many times, and the river is over there as well. So if I walk through here, I will actually end up at the river and at the road where I've been many times before. So I thought I would just go for a walk through here and see what things look like. A little detour. And I'd be very interested, I'd be surprised to find out that these little houses have addresses. You know, one would think that, where exactly am I going? This has kind of a gate here, which makes it seem like this is a private property, perhaps belonging to this, the company that makes these cement pipes. But all of these look like private homes. But I'm going to walk along here a little bit and see where I end up. But looking at all these, it's interesting to think about whether they have addresses or not. I would tend to think that they don't. Oh, got some meat cooking here. Smells good. Hello. Yeah, and here we are, coming out the other side. And there's the river right there, which I've walked along many times. And I've always been looking at this area from the point of view of the river. And over here is the road that I've walked down many times. So, my little walk has helped me make a connection between two neighborhoods in Mesot, a very familiar neighborhood and then an unfamiliar one. Okay, turning around, and I'm just going to walk back through this area. The area without addresses. So I'm going to turn the camera around again because I find this view so interesting. I hear some music coming out of this house. They're wired for electricity. And that's one thing about addresses that you think about right away. If you have an address, people can send you electricity bills, right? So without an address, how can they bill you, that kind of thing. But I'm getting ahead of my story. And as Deirdre Mask points out in her book, addresses play a large role in diseases and health and epidemics and pandemics like we're experiencing now. I was wondering whether Mesot would feel different today, because within the last week there was an incident here where truck drivers, at least one that I know about, a truck driver driving a truck from Myanmar, from Mayawadi, crossed over the second Friendship Bridge and then came to the market here in Mesot. And he was dropping off goods or picking up goods to bring back to Myanmar, one or the other, or both. And at some point in his journey, crossing the border, I assume, he was tested, and he tested positive. And that, of course, set off alarm bells for all the local health authorities, and they began a process of contact tracing, went back to the market, tracked down everyone that this man had come in contact with, tested all of those people. I'm not sure how many there were, and then they spread out and contacted the people that those people had been in contact with, tested them. And then there was a series of closures here. Schools were closed to be disinfected. I believe they're supposed to be open again today, but I haven't heard anything official. There were stories online about certain neighborhoods going into a kind of lockdown, whether voluntary or mandated. And of course, they beefed up the security along the border with Myanmar, and they changed quite a few of the rules for the drivers that are still allowed to drive back and forth between the two countries. So there's a lot going on right now. And I thought maybe as I was out walking around, I might run into some health officials. Apparently 3 mobile testing vehicles went out into Mesot, and they set up stations in the most affected neighborhoods of the city. And then they were testing people in those neighborhoods. But all this contact tracing involves a lot of locations, right? Where did this man go? What's the address of where he went? Who did he meet? What's the address of where those people live? So knowing people's addresses and people having a fixed address matters a lot when it comes to controlling pandemics of any kind. And one of the first stories Deirdre Mask tells is related to this, and I think it's one of the first stories in history to illustrate this principle. And it involves a doctor in Victorian England, Dr. John Snow, living in London, and they were experiencing a cholera epidemic. And at that time, the germ theory of disease didn't exist yet. Nobody knew about germs and microbes and viruses. No one had seen them, and nobody knew they existed or that they caused diseases. There were all these strange theories about how noxious air transmitted diseases and things like that. But this doctor had a different idea, and he didn't think the disease was transmitted through the air, through noxious air. And he apparently collected addresses of all the people who were falling ill with cholera. And then using those addresses, he could pinpoint them on maps. And he realized there was a cluster, a cholera outbreak centered in this one neighborhood in London. They went to that neighborhood, and all of the addresses that he had collected were centered around one water pump. And he didn't know for sure that the water was causing the cholera, but it was a pretty good guess. So the local officials were convinced to take the handle off that one water pump so nobody could get water from that well anymore. And when they did that, the cholera epidemic subsided and disappeared. So addresses were used kind of for contact tracing back in Victorian England by Dr. Snow, and it was used to halt the spread of cholera. I hadn't thought about this in a long time, but when I was in high school back in Canada, I had a job at a pharmacy, the Big V pharmacy, as a delivery boy. This was after I got my driver's license. I worked at the pharmacy before that, kind of as a cleaner, and I would stock the shelves. But once I got my driver's license, I became a delivery boy, and it was my job to drive around in the blue and white Big V car and deliver prescriptions door to door. And most of my customers were senior citizens, the elderly in my hometown. And a lot of them lived in big apartment buildings, or they had individual houses. So I would go to work after school, and when my shift started, there would be a big basket of maybe 30 prescriptions to be delivered. And the first thing I would have to do is go over all 30 prescriptions, scan the addresses on each label, and then think about the city streets, and then lay them out in order, in a logical order, for an efficient trip around the city. So I had to be an expert in the streets of my home city, because you also had to do this very fast. You couldn't sit there for an hour organizing your deliveries. I had to sit down with the 30 prescriptions and then really fast lay them out so that I could go in a circle around the city and deliver them all in a good order. You couldn't go out and deliver one, then just pick the next one and drive all the way across town, and you had to lay them out in an efficient delivery pattern. So I guess my connection with addresses goes back a long time. And then, of course, when I started traveling and then going bike touring, maps and addresses and directions became very important as well. Another aspect to addresses that Deirdre Mask talks about at length is the relationship between addresses and governments and security and privacy, those kinds of things. She tells the story of a certain period in the Habsburg Empire in Europe when they were fighting a lot of wars, and apparently the monarch, I think it was a queen at the time, needed more soldiers for her armies. And she came up with this idea to send her soldiers out into the city and kind of map it. So the soldiers went to all the towns in the Habsburg Empire and then went door to door, numbering all the houses, giving each house a number, and then making a record of who lives in that house. It was kind of one of the first census in history. And of course, the people living in those houses, they weren't very happy about that, because they were just living in their house in perfect security. And then a bunch of soldiers walk up to the house and put a number on your house and say, okay, we just numbered your house. Now we know exactly where you live, and we have a record of you, and we can keep track of you. And the people who had never had an address before, yeah, they weren't very happy about that. Stories like that are a big deal in countries with military governments or dictatorships, because the government can use addresses to track dissidents, know where they live, and of course round them up and arrest them when they want to. So an address, for me, from my point of view, growing up, an address was just a normal thing, and it was a matter of convenience. You had to have an address. Your friend comes over, you tell him where you live so he can find your house. You need to have Christmas cards delivered, which is a very nice thing, letters delivered, and to do any of that, you need an address. But in some countries around the world, people would resist having an address, because then the army would know where to find them and arrest them. So it's an interesting angle. And something else that I think about quite a bit is how you need an address for banking and anything official. And if you're a little bit of an international nomad, your life can get very complicated quite quickly, as happened to me recently, where someone got hold of my credit card information and started charging things to my card. My bank had to cancel that card and send me a new one. But of course, they have to send it to my address. And the only address I had was my official mailing address back in Canada. They can't ship it to me here in Thailand or Malaysia or Myanmar or any place like that. And if you don't have an address, like some kind of postal address, you really can't do anything. And if you are homeless in the United States or Canada or somewhere, it's really hard to get your life back together, because if you're homeless, how do you get ID? Like, how do you start building up your official life again? You know, you need a driver's license, your birth certificate, health insurance card. Even for employment, you know, you try to fill out the application form for a job. The first thing they want to know is where you live. What's your address? And if you can't supply an address, you can't even apply for a job. So you can't get work. So yeah, an address is a very important thing. I'm just standing outside of the Chavy coffee shop. I'm going to go in for a second. One last thing before I head in there. I keep talking about pinpointing the location of places and using addresses to do it, or using descriptions. There's one other thing I came across that was mentioned in this podcast that I found absolutely fascinating. And it is a completely new way of identifying and sharing locations around the world. A new website, a brand new technology that I knew nothing about, and I find it quite fascinating. And later in the video, I'll tell you about it. Considering what I said earlier on about the truck drivers from Myanmar that tested positive and the reaction to that here in Mae Sot, I haven't seen anything going on as I've been walking around the city today. Nothing seems unusual or out of the ordinary, except feels a little bit quiet, considering it's the middle of the week. The streets do feel a little bit quieter than normal, and that could be because of the situation. And a lot more of the businesses appear to be closed than is normal. And here's a good example of that. I'm standing in front of the Hebron Youth Directions Foundation. They have a nice coffee shop in here I've been to several times. I noticed it's closed, and they do have a sign that says Hebron is temporarily closed for this whole week due to the COVID outbreak. That's a bit misleading because, as far as I'm aware, there is no COVID outbreak happening. I did see an article that said of the 70 people that were tested who had direct contact with this truck driver, all 70 of them tested negative. So I don't think there is any sort of an outbreak going on, but there is a heightened concern and an increase in measures at the moment. So people are just being cautious and keeping things closed for the duration. Well, here I am back at the bridge, very close to my guest house, and that means it's time to wind this up. Going to settle in for a little bit and get out of the worst of the heat of midday. And as always, thank you for coming with me. I hope you enjoyed a few of those little glances at some of the street life things going on here in Mae Sot. And I'll see you in the next video. I stopped walking because I'm actually standing right beside my first destination, the Hop Inn. And there it is over there, bright white and blue. Got a guy over there repainting a section of it. And I was wondering whether they had a little cafe or a restaurant up on the top. But I don't know how to get inside this place. Maybe the entrance is back this way. Or perhaps it's from the main highway, because the main highway is just over there. Let's go take a look. Here's another side of the Hop Inn. There's no entrance on this side, so I guess I have to keep going around. Well, at long last, I think I found the entrance to the Hop Inn. There it is there. I don't think there's anything particularly special about this place, except from what I read online, it is reasonably priced for a standard hotel of this kind. It's the type of hotel where you know what you're going to get. You pay 600 baht or whatever it is, and you kind of know what you get for your money. The kind of place where I'm staying at a guest house, of course, you never know. There's so much variety inside them. You have no idea what they could be like. At a place like this, it's pretty standard. And I assume that's part of its appeal. But I'm just interested to see if there's a rooftop cafe. I suspect there isn't, but I'm just going to see if I can find out. So that is the end of my hop-in adventures. There is no rooftop cafe, there's no rooftop access or anything like that. They do have a little restaurant here where I guess hotel guests have their morning breakfast. But in terms of getting up on the roof, no, that's not possible. But I'm glad I came here anyway. I stumbled across that nursery, which I would not have found otherwise.